The morning mist clung to the walls of the Forbidden City like smoke from a dying fire. But Captain James Morrison of the United States Marine Corps knew that the real inferno was only beginning. It was June 15th, 1900, and the ancient capital of China trembled under the weight of revolution. From his position atop the American legation compound in Beijing, Morrison watched as thousands of white-clad figures moved through the narrow hutongs, like ghosts seeking vengeance against the living. The Boxers, or as they called themselves, the Righteous and Harmonious Fists, had transformed from a mystical secret society into a force that threatened to consume all foreign presence in China. Their leader, a peasant-turned-prophet named Zhu Hongdang, preached that foreign devils had poisoned the Middle Kingdom with railways, telegraphs, and Christian missionaries. Now, with the tacit support of Empress Dowager Cixi, these martial artists believed their ancient fighting techniques and magical rituals could make them invulnerable to foreign bullets. Morrison adjusted his field glasses and observed the growing crowd gathering. Near the Temple of Heaven, men, women, and even children wore the characteristic white headbands and red sashes that marked them as followers of the Boxer movement. They carried traditional weapons, swords, spears, and halberds that gleamed wickedly in the early morning sun. Their chants echoed across the city like thunder before a storm. Support the king. Destroy the foreign. The irony was not lost on the American officer. Just 2 years earlier, the United States had fought Spain for control of the Philippines, declaring itself a champion of freedom and democracy. Now, American forces found themselves defending foreign enclaves in a country that had never invited their presence. The open-door policy championed by Secretary of State John Hay had promised equal commercial access to China for all Western powers, but it had also inadvertently opened the door to this violent backlash. As recorded in dispatches from the New York Herald correspondent in Beijing, the situation had deteriorated rapidly over the past month. What had begun as isolated attacks on Christian converts in Shandong province had spread like wildfire across northern China. Railway lines had been torn up, telegraph poles toppled, and farm-built structures demolished with methodical fury. The Boxers believed that by destroying these symbols of Western influence, they could restore China's spiritual harmony and drive out the foreign presence forever. Morrison's thoughts were interrupted by the arrival of his commanding officer, Colonel Robert Meade, whose weathered face bore the grim expression of a man who had seen too many battles. "Captain, we've received word from Minister Conger at the American legation. The situation is deteriorating faster than anticipated. The Boxers have begun attacking Chinese Christians in the Tartar city, and we have reports of foreign missionaries being murdered in the provinces." The colonel paused, scanning the horizon where smoke columns rose from burning buildings. President McKinley has authorized the deployment of additional forces from the Philippines. The 6th Cavalry Regiment under Colonel Emerson Liscombe is already en route from Tientsin, but they may not arrive in time. He handed Morrison a telegram. The German minister was assassinated yesterday. Baron von Kettler was shot down in broad daylight while traveling to the foreign ministry under a flag of truce. Morrison felt a chill run down his spine. The murder of a foreign diplomat was an act of war by any civilized standard. Around them, the other members of the international garrison, British, French, Russian, German, Italian, Austrian, and Japanese soldiers, were preparing their defenses with the grim efficiency of men who knew they were vastly outnumbered. The total foreign force in Beijing numbered fewer than 500 men, while intelligence reports suggested that over 100,000 Boxers were converging on the capital. As the sun climbed higher, casting long shadows across the compound, Morrison realized that they were witnesses to a pivotal moment in world history. The 19th century's age of imperial expansion was colliding head-on with an ancient civilization's desperate attempt to preserve its identity. The outcome of this confrontation would determine not only the fate of China, but also America's role as an emerging world power in the new century that had just begun. The first shots rang out at precisely 4:30 in the afternoon on June 20th, 1900, shattering the uneasy calm that had settled over the legation quarter. Private Thomas Sullivan of the 14th Infantry Regiment was manning his post along the perimeter wall when he saw the first wave of Boxers charging across the open ground, their white robes billowing like the wings of avenging angels. Their war cries filled the air, ancient invocations mixed with promises of death. To all foreign devils, here they come, Sullivan shouted, raising his Krag-Jurgensen rifle to his shoulder. The distinctive crack of American Springfield ammunition joined the symphony of international firepower as British Lee-Enfields, German Mausers, and Russian Mosin-Nagants opened up from positions along the hastily constructed barricades. The Boxers fell in waves, But for every one that dropped, two more seemed to take his place. Within the American legation compound, Minister Edwin Conger was coordinating with his international counterparts via a network of hastily strung telephone lines. The siege had officially begun when Empress Dowager Cixi issued an imperial decree declaring war on all foreign powers present in China. As reported in later accounts by missionaries who survived the ordeal, the Empress had finally thrown her full support behind the Boxer movement. After being convinced that the foreign powers intended to depose her and partition China among themselves, Captain Morrison found himself in command of a mixed force of Marines, sailors from the gunboat Monocacy, and civilian volunteers who had taken up arms to defend their families. The tactical situation was desperate. The combined international garrison controlled an area of roughly 3 square miles. In the heart of Beijing, surrounded by a sea of hostile territory, the Boxers had cut all telegraph lines to the outside world, leaving the defenders isolated and unable to call for reinforcement. Water supplies were limited, ammunition was finite, and food stores would last perhaps to weeks under rationing. What made the situation even more treacherous was the involvement of regular Chinese Imperial Army troops. Units of the Kansu Braves, elite Muslim soldiers from western China, had joined the Boxers in their assault on the legations. These were not mystical peasants armed with medieval weapons, but disciplined soldiers equipped with modern rifles and artillery. Their commander, General Dong Fuxiang, had positioned several field pieces to shell the international compound, and the thunderous explosions sent masonry cascading down upon the defenders. During a brief lull in the fighting, Morrison made his way to the hospital that had been established in the basement of the British legation. Dr. Morrison, no relation, a correspondent for the Times of London who had trained as a physician, was treating wounded soldiers and civilians with supplies that were rapidly dwindling. "Captain," he said without looking up from his patient, "we've lost 12 men since the siege began, and we have 23 wounded. At this rate, we won't last a week." The American officer studied the faces around him: British diplomats, German businessmen, Italian missionaries, American children who should have been playing in gardens instead of cowering in bomb shelters. They all looked to the international garrison for protection. But Morrison knew that protection was becoming increasingly difficult to provide. Outside, the night sky was lit by the flames of burning buildings. The Boxers had systematically destroyed every church, school, and hospital in Beijing that bore any connection to foreign influence. The magnificent Cathedral of the Immaculate Conception, built by French missionaries over decades of patient work, was now a smoking ruin. The sounds of destruction carried on the wind the crash of falling timber, the roar of flames, and always the chanting of the Boxers as they celebrated each demolished symbol of Western presence. As Morrison returned to his command post, he encountered Colonel Meade studying a hand-drawn map of the city. "Captain, we've received word through Chinese intermediaries that relief columns are being organized in Tientsin. Admiral Seymour is attempting to advance along the railway line with an international force, but the Boxers have torn up the tracks and are fighting a running battle along the entire route." Morrison nodded grimly. Tientsin was 80 miles away. It might as well have been 800 under current conditions. As he prepared for another night of siege warfare, he wondered whether the morning sun would rise on American survivors or on a foreign cemetery. In the heart of ancient China, Admiral Edward Seymour of the Royal Navy stood on the platform of Tientsin Railway Station, surveying the most unusual military force ever assembled under his command. It was June 10th, 1900, and before him stretched a column of 2,000 soldiers representing 8 different nations, each wearing their distinctive uniforms and carrying their national weapons. The sight reminded him of a chess set come to life: Russian Cossacks with their curved sabers, German Marines in their spiked helmets, American doughboys with their broad-brimmed campaign hats, and Japanese infantry whose discipline impressed even the most seasoned European officers. The mission seemed straightforward enough: advance along the Beijing-Tientsin railway line, repair the tracks as they went, and relieve the besieged legations in the Chinese capital. What Admiral Seymour had not anticipated was the sheer scale of destruction that awaited them. As noted in contemporary accounts from the London Times, the Boxers had not merely damaged the railway, they had systematically obliterated every mile of track, every bridge, every station, and every water tower along the entire 80-mile route. Colonel Emerson Liscombe of the American 9th Infantry Regiment commanded the largest single contingent of United States forces in the relief column. His men were veterans of the Philippine-American War, hardened by years of fighting insurgents in tropical jungles, and familiar with the challenges of unconventional warfare. But China presented unique difficulties that no amount of experience could have prepared them for. Admiral Colonel Liscombe reported during their first morning briefing, "My scouts report that the railway bridge at Langfang has been completely destroyed. The Boxers didn't just damage it, they used gunpowder to demolish the stone foundation and then scattered the pieces across the river bed. We're looking at days of engineering work just to create a temporary crossing." The international nature of the relief force created its own complications. Language barriers slowed communication. Different tactical doctrines led to confusion during combat operations, and national rivalries occasionally surfaced even in the face of a common enemy. The Russian contingent, commanded by Admiral Alexeyev, seemed more interested in securing permanent bases along the railway line than in reaching Beijing quickly. The German forces, still burning with anger over the assassination of their minister, Baron von Kettler, advocated for harsh reprisals against any Chinese civilians encountered along the route. Private William Foster of the 14th Infantry Regiment kept a diary throughout the campaign, and his entries reveal the daily frustrations faced by the common soldiers. June 15th marched 8 miles today and fought 3 separate engagements with Boxer forces. They appear from nowhere, attack with incredible ferocity, then vanish into the countryside before we can pursue them effectively. Lost 2 men from our company included Sergeant Murphy, who was struck by a spear thrown from 50 yards away. The Chinese fighters move like ghosts and fight like demons. The Boxers had adopted guerrilla tactics that maximized their advantages while minimizing their technological disadvantage. They struck at dawn and dusk when visibility was poor, targeted isolated units and supply trains, and used their intimate knowledge of the terrain to stage ambushes in narrow mountain passes and dense vegetation. When faced with superior firepower, they melted away into the rural population, making it impossible for foreign forces to distinguish between hostile combatants and innocent civilians. Captain Henry Leonard of the 5th Artillery Regiment was responsible for the column's field guns, and he quickly discovered that conventional artillery tactics were useless against an enemy that refused to concentrate in large formations. "We're firing at shadows," he wrote to his wife in a letter that was later published in the Army and Navy Journal. "The Boxers attack in small groups, strike hard, and disappear before we can bring our guns to bear. It's like trying to kill mosquitoes with a sledgehammer." The relief columns advanced slowed to a crawl as engineers worked frantically to rebuild destroyed infrastructure while fighting off constant attacks. By June 22nd, Admiral Seymour faced a crucial decision. His force had covered less than half the distance to Beijing and had already suffered over 300 casualties. Radio communications with the capital had been severed, leaving them with no knowledge of the situation in the legation quarter. Intelligence reports suggested that massive Boxer armies were concentrated between their position and Beijing, while other forces were moving to cut off their retreat to Tientsin. As the admiral studied his maps that evening, Colonel Liscombe approached with disturbing news. "Sir, we've captured a Chinese courier carrying dispatches for General Dong Fuxiang, the Boxer commanders in this area. According to the documents, the Empress Dowager has issued an official declaration of war against all foreign powers. This is no longer a police action. We're in the middle of an international war." The implications were staggering. What had begun as a rescue mission was now a military campaign that could determine the future of China and the balance of power in East Asia. The thunderous roar of naval gunfire shattered the pre-dawn quiet of the Paiho River, as Admiral Sir Edward Seymour's international fleet opened fire on the ancient Taku forts. It was June 17, 1900, and the massive stone fortifications that had guarded the approaches to Tientsin for over 2 centuries were about to face the concentrated firepower of the modern industrial age. The American protected cruiser Newark, under Captain Bowman McCalla, took her position in the battle line alongside British, German, French, Italian, Austrian, and Japanese warships. Commander Frederick Wise of the United States Navy stood on the bridge of the gunboat Monocacy, watching as the first salvo from the international fleet struck the fortress walls. The ancient Chinese cannons mounted in the forts were no match for the rapid-firing guns and high-explosive shells of the Western warships. But the Chinese defenders fought with a courage that commanded respect even from their enemies. Black powder smoke billowed from the fortress embrasures as the Chinese artillery returned fire, their solid iron cannonballs splashing harmlessly into the water dozens of yards short of their targets. The strategic importance of the Taku forts could not be overstated. These massive stone bastions controlled the mouth of the Paiho River, the only navigable waterway that connected the port city of Tientsin to the sea. Without control of these fortifications, the international powers could not maintain their supply lines or evacuate their civilians. From the interior of China, the Chinese commander, Admiral Liu, understood this perfectly and had spent weeks preparing his defenses for the inevitable assault. As recorded in dispatches sent by Reuters correspondent Morrison, the bombardment continued for 3 hours with devastating effect. 10-inch stone walls, built to withstand medieval siege weapons, crumbled under the impact of modern naval artillery. Great chunks of masonry tumbled into the river, and by mid-morning, gaps began to appear in the fortress walls. The Chinese defenders, however, refused to abandon their positions and continued fighting from the ruins of their fortifications. Captain McCalla coordinated the American contribution to the assault. Through flag signals and steam whistle commands, the Newark 6-inch guns maintained a steady rate of fire, each shell precisely aimed at the fortress walls to create practicable breaches for the infantry assault that would follow. The crew worked with mechanical precision, loading and firing in a rhythm that spoke to years of training and discipline. Despite the heat and smoke, morale remained high among the American sailors, who understood they were participating in a historic naval action. The human cost of the bombardment was severe on both sides. Chinese casualties mounted as shells exploded within the fortress compounds, but Western forces also suffered losses when lucky shots from the Chinese cannons found their targets. The German cruiser Iltis took a direct hit that killed 3 sailors and wounded 7 others, while shrapnel from an exploding Chinese shell damaged the Austrian gunboat Zena's forward gun mount. Lieutenant Charles Hill of the United States Marine Corps was assigned to coordinate the landing parties that would storm the forts once the naval bombardment had done its work. As he studied the fortress walls through his field glasses, he marveled at the courage of the Chinese defenders who continued to man their guns. Despite the overwhelming firepower arrayed against them, these men may be fighting with obsolete weapons, he wrote in his journal, but they are dying for their country with a bravery that would do credit to any army in the world. The international nature of the assault created unique challenges for the naval commanders. Each nation's ships operated under different signal systems, used different types of ammunition, and followed different tactical doctrines. The Japanese cruiser Kasagi, for example, employed rapid salvos designed to suppress enemy fire, while the British warships focused on deliberate, aimed shots intended to breach specific sections of the fortress walls. Coordinating these different approaches required constant communication and adjustment of the battle plan. By noon, the effectiveness of modern naval gunnery had become undeniably clear. The fortress walls were breached in multiple locations. Most of the Chinese artillery had been silenced, and smoke from burning buildings within the compound signaled that the defenses were collapsing. Admiral Liu, recognizing that further resistance was futile, ordered his surviving troops to evacuate the forts and withdraw inland toward Beijing. The landing parties went ashore at 2 o'clock in the afternoon, meeting surprisingly light resistance as they advanced through the smoking ruins of the ancient fortifications. Chinese casualties were estimated at over 400 killed and wounded, while international losses totaled 37 dead and 112 wounded. The Taku forts, which had symbolized Chinese sovereignty over their coastal waters for centuries, were now under foreign control, as the Stars and Stripes was raised over the northern fort, alongside the flags of the other Allied powers. Captain McCalla reflected on the broader implications of their victory. The bombardment had been a tactical success that secured the sea route to Tientsin, but it had also marked a new phase in the conflict. What had begun as a rescue mission was evolving into a full-scale military occupation of Chinese territory. The consequences of this transformation would resonate throughout China for generations to come. The ancient Chinese city of Tientsin had become a fortress, its narrow streets barricaded with overturned carts, torn-up paving stones, and household furniture pressed into service as improvised defensive positions. General Ni Shiqing, one of China's most capable military commanders, had transformed the foreign concessions into a killing ground, where every window might conceal a sniper and every doorway could hide an explosive device. It was July 13th, 1900, and the International Relief Force was about to fight the most brutal urban battle in Chinese history. Colonel Emerson Liscombe of the American 9th Infantry Regiment studied the city through his field glasses from a position on the muddy banks of the Grand Canal. Before him stretched a maze of traditional Chinese architecture mixed with European-style buildings that housed the various foreign trading companies and diplomatic missions. Smoke rose from a dozen fires, and the crack of rifle fire echoed continuously across the water as Chinese sharpshooters engaged. Any foreign soldier who showed himself in the open The tactical situation was complex beyond anything the international commanders had previously encountered. General Ni had abandoned the conventional Chinese military doctrine of massed infantry charges in favor of sophisticated urban warfare techniques. His forces included regular Imperial Army troops armed with modern German Mauser rifles, Boxer irregulars who knew every alley and secret passage in the city, and Kanzu braves whose reputation for ferocity was legendary throughout China. These diverse forces had been organized into a defensive system that maximized the advantages of fighting on familiar terrain. Lieutenant William Mitchell of the United States Army Signal Corps, who would later become famous as an aviation pioneer, was responsible for coordinating communications between the various national contingents during the assault. His field telephone system connected American, British, Russian, German, French, Italian, Austrian, and Japanese command posts, creating an unprecedented level of international military cooperation. The complexity of commanding troops who speak 8 different languages while fighting an enemy who knows the ground better than we do, Mitchell wrote in his official report, presents challenges that no military academy could have prepared us for. The battle began at dawn with a coordinated artillery barrage that targeted known Chinese strong points within the city, American field guns positioned alongside German howitzers, and British naval guns that had been dragged inland from the fleet poured high explosive shells into the narrow streets for 30 minutes. The bombardment was designed to suppress Chinese fire and create gaps in the defensive barriers, but its effectiveness was limited by the need to avoid destroying the very buildings that housed foreign civilians who might still be alive within the city, as documented in contemporary accounts from the Shanghai Mercury. The assault itself commenced with simultaneous advances from 4 different directions. The American contingent, reinforced by 2 companies of British infantry, attacked from the southeast along the Grand Canal waterfront. Russian forces advanced from the north, while German and Austrian troops moved against the western approaches to the city. Japanese infantry, supported by their own artillery, struck from the east in a coordinated movement designed to prevent Chinese forces from concentrating their defenses. Private James O'Brien of the 14th Infantry Regiment was among the first Americans to enter the city streets, and his memoir provides a vivid account of the house-to-house fighting that followed. The Chinese had barricaded every street with furniture, sandbags, and even cartwheels filled with earth. They cut loopholes in the walls of buildings and positioned snipers to cover every approach. We had to fight for every yard, sometimes crawling forward on our bellies under intense fire, then rushing the next barricade when our artillery had silenced the defenders. The urban fighting revealed both the strengths and weaknesses of late 19th century military technology. The Chinese defenders' Mauser rifles were deadly accurate at close range and could penetrate the light field fortifications that the international forces constructed. As they advanced, however, the attackers possessed superior artillery support and could call down devastating fire on any Chinese position that revealed itself. The result was a brutal, grinding battle of attrition where tactical success was measured in city blocks rather than miles. Colonel Liscombe proved himself to be an exceptional combat leader during the street fighting, personally leading his troops in charges against fortified positions and maintaining morale through his own example of courage under fire. When a Chinese counterattack threatened to overwhelm an isolated company of his regiment, Liscombe gathered a force of volunteers and led them through sniper-infested streets to reinforce the threatened position. His leadership style inspired fierce loyalty among his men, who followed him into situations that other units might have declared impossible. The turning point in the battle came when Japanese engineers succeeded in blowing a gap in the ancient city wall that allowed their infantry to outflank the main Chinese defensive line. General Ni, recognizing that his position was becoming untenable, ordered a fighting withdrawal toward Beijing. His troops conducted a masterful delaying action, falling back from one prepared position to the next, while inflicting maximum casualties on their pursuers. By evening on July 14th, Tientsin was under international control, but the cost had been severe. Colonel Liscombe lay dead, struck down by a Chinese bullet while leading his final charge against a Boxer stronghold. In the center of the city, American casualties totaled 62 killed and 143 wounded, while Chinese losses were estimated at over 800 dead. The battle had demonstrated that modern warfare in urban environments favored defenders who were willing to fight for every building and every street corner. As the Allied flags were raised over the ruins of Tientsin's government buildings, the international commanders began planning their next move. Beijing lay 80 miles to the west, and intelligence reports suggested that Chinese forces were preparing even stronger defenses. Around the capital, the siege of the legations continued, and time was running out for the foreign civilians trapped in the heart of the Forbidden City. The dust clouds stretched across the horizon like a brown curtain drawn against the azure sky of northern China. General Adna Chaffee, commanding officer of the American Expeditionary Force, rode at the head of a column that represented the largest international military cooperation in modern history. It was August 4th, 1900, and 14,000 soldiers from 8 nations were marching toward Beijing in what would become known as the China Relief Expedition. The very ground seemed to tremble under the weight of artillery pieces, supply wagons, and the measured tread of infantry units that had traveled halfway around the world to fight in this ancient land. Major General Chaffee had assumed command of American forces after the death of Colonel Liscombe at Tientsin, and he brought to the campaign a wealth of experience gained during the Indian Wars and the Spanish-American War. His force now included elements of the 6th Cavalry Regiment, the 9th and 14th Infantry Regiments, the 5th Artillery Regiment, and a battalion of Marines who had distinguished themselves during the siege of the Taku forts. These battle-hardened veterans understood that they were participating in a historic military expedition that would determine America's role in the emerging global balance of power. The march itself presented logistical challenges that tested the organizational abilities of every participating nation. The international force consumed enormous quantities of food, water, ammunition, and medical supplies, all of which had to be transported across terrain that had been devastated by months of warfare. Chinese forces had systematically destroyed wells, burned granaries, and poisoned water sources in an attempt to slow the foreign advance. Through denial of local resources, Captain Charles Morton of the Army Corps of Engineers was responsible for maintaining the primitive road system that connected Tientsin to Beijing, and his daily reports reveal the scale of destruction that confronted the relief column. The Chinese have not merely damaged infrastructure, he wrote in his official correspondence. They have methodically obliterated every bridge, culvert, and causeway along the route. We are essentially building a new road as we advance, while simultaneously fighting off attacks from Boxer forces who appear and disappear like morning mist. The international nature of the expedition created a complex command structure that required constant diplomatic as well as military attention. General Chaffee worked alongside Russian General Linovich, British General Gasly, German Field Marshal von Waldersee, French General Frey, Italian General Garioni, Austrian Colonel von Hein, and Japanese General Yamaguchi. Each commander brought his own national interests and tactical doctrines to the campaign, and coordination often required delicate negotiations conducted in multiple languages while under enemy fire, as recorded in dispatches published by the Associated Press. The Chinese defense of the route to Beijing demonstrated a level of strategic sophistication that surprised the foreign commanders. General Dong Fuxiang and his Kansu Braves had established a series of defensive positions at key terrain features along the march route, each designed to inflict maximum casualties on the advancing international force while preserving Chinese strength for the final defense of the capital. These positions were skillfully camouflaged and mutually supporting, requiring coordinated attacks by multiple national contingents to overcome. The Battle of Yangkun on August 5th proved to be the most significant engagement during the march. Chinese forces had fortified a series of hills overlooking the main road, positioning artillery pieces and rifle pits to create interlocking fields of fire that swept the entire valley. The American 9th Infantry Regiment, supported by British artillery and German cavalry, conducted a frontal assault against the Chinese positions while Russian and Japanese forces executed flanking movements designed to envelope the defenders. Lieutenant Harry Hill of the 5th Artillery Regiment directed the American battery during the engagement, and his account provides insight into the tactical evolution of modern warfare. The Chinese artillery was surprisingly effective, he wrote to the Army and Navy Journal. Their gunners had been trained by German advisors and were using modern field pieces with time-fused shells. We found ourselves engaged in a counter-battery duel that required all our skill and experience to win. The enemy fought with tremendous courage and only withdrew when their positions became absolutely untenable. Private Thomas Murphy of the 14th Infantry Regiment kept a diary throughout the march that captures the perspective of the common soldier. August 7th fought 3 separate engagements today. The heat is brutal, water is scarce, and the Chinese seem to know exactly where we're going before we get there. But morale remains high because we know we're getting close to Beijing and the end of this campaign. The officers say we can see the smoke from the capital on clear days. The psychological pressure on the international force was intensified by their complete lack of information about the situation in Beijing. No communications had been received from the besieged legations for over 6 weeks, and rumors circulated that all foreign civilians in the capital had been massacred. This uncertainty drove the relief column forward with desperate urgency, knowing that every day of delay might mean the difference between rescue and revenge. By August 10th, advanced scouts reported that the walls of Beijing were visible on the horizon. The international force had covered 80 miles of hostile territory in 6 days, fighting 11 separate engagements and overcoming obstacles that would have stopped a less determined expedition. General Chaffee gathered his commanders for a final planning conference as they prepared for what would surely be the most difficult battle of the entire campaign, the assault on the ancient capital of the Chinese Empire. The fate of the besieged legations, the future of China, and America's emergence as a global military power all hung in the balance. As the relief column prepared for its final advance toward the walls of the Forbidden City, the ancient walls of Beijing rose from the dusty plain like monuments to eternity itself, their massive stone blocks worn smooth by centuries of wind and weather. But on the morning of August 14th, 1900, these seemingly impregnable fortifications faced the concentrated assault of the most powerful military force ever assembled on Chinese soil. General Abner Chaffee positioned his American troops alongside their international allies, as 14,000 soldiers prepared to storm the capital of the oldest continuous civilization on Earth. The siege of the legation quarter had lasted 55 days, and no word had been received from the defenders for over 3 weeks. Intelligence reports from Chinese deserters suggested that most of the foreign civilians had been killed, and that Boxer forces were using the legation buildings as fortified positions. The relief column had traveled 3,000 miles and fought dozens of battles to reach this moment. But they still did not know whether they were conducting a rescue operation or planning a memorial service for the dead. Captain Frank Eastman of the 14th Infantry Regiment led the 1st American assault wave. As it approached the Chaoyang Gate on the southeastern wall of the city, his men had painted their faces with mud to reduce the glare of the morning sun and wrapped cloth around their rifles to muffle the sound of metal against metal. The Chinese defenders had constructed elaborate obstacles in front of the wall's bamboo spikes, concealed pits, and entanglements of barbed wire that would channel any attacking force into predetermined killing zones. The international assault began simultaneously at 4 different points around the city perimeter, but coordination proved difficult due to the language barriers and different tactical approaches employed by each national contingent. As documented in reports later published by the War Department, the Japanese attacked with disciplined precision, the Russians with overwhelming force, the Germans with methodical thoroughness, and the Americans with characteristic initiative and flexibility. Each approach reflected the military culture of its respective nation, but all were united in their determination to reach the trapped civilians in the legation quarter. The bombardment of Beijing's walls commenced at dawn with a thunderous barrage from over 50 pieces of artillery representing 8 different nations. American field guns, positioned alongside German siege mortars and British naval guns, poured high explosive shells into the ancient fortifications for 2 hours. The medieval stonework, built to withstand catapults and battering rams, began to crumble under the impact of modern artillery. Great gaps appeared in the walls as centuries of Chinese craftsmanship collapsed into rubble and dust. Sergeant William Davis of the 9th Infantry Regiment was among the first Americans to enter the city through a breach in the eastern wall, and his memoir provides a vivid account of the urban fighting that followed. The streets were like a maze designed by madmen, he wrote years later. Every building was a fortress, every alley was a trap, and every rooftop concealed snipers who seemed to have an unlimited supply of ammunition. We fought from house to house, room by room, sometimes using bayonets and rifle butts when our ammunition ran low. The Chinese defense of Beijing demonstrated the evolution of their military thinking. Throughout the Boxer Rebellion, General Dong Fuxiang had abandoned the massed infantry charges that characterized traditional Chinese warfare in favor of sophisticated urban combat techniques. His forces used the city's ancient architecture to their advantage, creating interlocking fields of fire that swept every street and square. Explosive devices, concealed in seemingly innocent locations, inflicted heavy casualties on the advancing international forces. As the relief column fought its way toward the center of the city, they discovered evidence of the terrible destruction that had been visited upon Beijing's foreign community. Churches had been reduced to smoking ruins, schools and hospitals laying rubble, and the bodies of Chinese Christians who had sought foreign protection were scattered throughout the streets. The Boxer movement had achieved its goal of eliminating foreign influence from the capital, but at a cost in human life that shocked even hardened combat veterans. The breakthrough came at 3 o'clock in the afternoon when American forces, fighting alongside British Marines, reached the outer perimeter of the legation quarter. Captain Morrison, who had commanded the American garrison throughout the siege, emerged from behind a hastily constructed barricade, with tears streaming down his smoke-blackened face. Of the original 450 foreign civilians who had taken refuge in the legations, 312 had survived the 55-day ordeal. They were emaciated, exhausted, and traumatized, but they were alive. The reunion between the relief force and the siege survivors was an emotional moment that transcended national boundaries and political differences. American soldiers shared their rations with German civilians. British officers tended wounded Italian missionaries, and Japanese medics provided care for Austrian children who had spent nearly 2 months living in basement shelters. The international cooperation that had made the relief expedition possible continued as the survivors were evacuated to safety and medical treatment. General Chaffee established his headquarters in the former Imperial Palace, symbolically demonstrating that the power of the Chinese Empire had been broken by international military force. The Boxer Rebellion was effectively over, though scattered fighting would continue in the provinces for several more months. The consequences of the conflict would reshape China's relationship with the world and establish the United States as a major player in East Asian affairs. As the American flag flew over Beijing alongside the banners of the Allied powers, the 19th century's age of imperial expansion reached its climax in the heart of the oldest empire on Earth. The dragon had awakened, fought with desperate courage, and been subdued by the combined might of the modern world. The 20th century was about to begin, and nothing in China would ever be the same again.